Welcome to the Hockey Writers Maple Leafs Lounge, a weekly show from our Toronto Maple Leafs writing crew, bringing you the latest news, rumors, trades, player grades, prospects, and much more. From training camp to the playoffs, from draft day to the trade deadline, our team covers everything that happens with the blue and white. Come on in and pull up a chair. Welcome to the Maple Leafs Lounge.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Maple Leafs Lounge. I am your host, Peter Baracchini, and as always, I'm joined by my fellow Maple Leaf writer over at the Hockey Writers, Jim Parsons. Jim, it's been very quiet the last couple of weeks, and until basically the last few days, the last week or so, when Ilya Samsonov was going to an arbitrator to try and work out his contract negotiation. And we have some news to talk about finally. Before we get into that, how have you been these last few weeks?
Good. It's been busy, but not as busy, right? With free agency now well into its whatever week we're in now, and most of the big names off the board. We're waiting on a couple names. I'm watching, the situation for Matt Dumba. I'm watching the situation for Vladimir Tarasenko, but it's slower now. So that's kind of nice that it's calmed down a little bit. So this Ilya Samsonov news is probably the biggest news of late, other than Patrice Bergeron's retirement today. So, there's always something going on, and it's fun to cover it all. But I'm happy and excited to talk a little Maple Leafs today.
Absolutely. And I do want to give a big shout out to Patrice Bergeron on a fantastic 19-year career. I remember him when he first started off in juniors, watching him at the World Junior Championship, and then working his way up to the NHL. He was just been an absolute pro on and off the ice. Great, fantastic two-way player, as the Selke trophies show for it. Hopefully they can rename that the Bergeron Trophy in the near future. We wish him the best of luck in retirement, because despite him being a Boston Bruin, he was one of my all-time favorite players that was not a Maple Leaf. So once again, best of luck to him and happy retirement to Patrice Bergeron.
Yeah, he holds a different place in Maple Leafs fandom's hearts, right? Like he's the guy that you've watched for a long time. And when he played against you, you absolutely hated it because he would cripple you sometimes, but you couldn't help but totally respect his game and the way that he approached the league and hockey and the sport and everything else that he did for it. And now that he's officially done, we're all kind of going, oh man, like it's going to be different without him. So wonderful career. Maybe nobody better in terms of representing the league and just kind of showing how it should be done. And a lot of players coming out today talking about it too. Brad Marchand, Sidney Crosby. I saw some comments from them today. So it was, a pretty tough day, but a touching one too.
And it shows the respect that he has around the league. So very, very well-deserved career. And as you mentioned, heartbreaker for the Maple Leafs, aka 2013. I believe it was both the tying and game-winning goal in overtime, and something that we just want to forget about. And we are going to forget about that because we are going to get into the Ilya Samsonov news. As you all may know, that Samsonov was rewarded a 1-year, $3.55 million contract by an independent arbitrator on Sunday. They went to an arbitrator on Friday. It took 48 hours for a ruling to come down. It came down Sunday afternoon. Jim, what are your initial thoughts on this contract? Is it fair? Is it what you expected?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the idea is it's got to be fair, right? Like they're using every independent thing that they can, from comparables in the league to the numbers and stats. I guess they don't really look at analytics too hard, but it's what you would think you would get, right? Teams typically are in favor of arbitration when it comes to the awards that are given out, right? It tends to lean towards the organization a little bit more than it does the player. So I'm not surprised that it leaned a little bit more towards the Maple Leafs here, but only by $100,000. So it's not like if you were to take his quest for a certain amount of money and then the Maple Leafs and what they pitched and go right down the middle. It was pretty darn close. So it's right where I thought it would be. I am more interested in the whole idea of going to arbitration with Samsonov, why they did this, what it's going to mean moving forward, what this means for his season. That's going to be much more of the story to take away from this. But $3.55 million, absolutely the lowest that probably Toronto was going to get this done for. So if that was the idea and that was the priority, this is the way to do it.
Absolutely. And I believe you mentioned something about the contract comparables. And I believe there was a post by David Alter where maybe they were trying to use other players as, sort of a comparable. I believe one of them, I think, was Jake Ottinger, that they wanted to try and use him as a starting point. UC Saros as well was another contract that they could try and use in their advantage in terms of Samsonov's camp to try and get more out of that. But yeah, I agree. It was most likely going to lean towards a short-term deal. I think that was the best fit for both sides, and I think that's what they agreed upon. But I would have thought that maybe, you know, we are going to get to this a little bit later on in the show in terms of like the length and what it means for other players. But I do think that maybe a 2-3 year deal probably would have been a little bit better, because it still gives him a little bit more security in that regard. But I still think that the value is fair. You know, you look at the stats, and again, you know, arbitration cases is more based on comparables and the stats, but Samsonov was among the best in, you know, among the goaltenders in the league. And looking at his stats on Natural Stat Trick, you know, he's in top 10 in save percentage at 5-on-5. He was top 5 in goals against average, and even his high danger save percentage, he was tops in the league at .901. So those are fantastic numbers, considering that this was a season where he bet big on himself. But I think this is also an opportunity for him to once again prove that last season wasn't, you know, a fluke, and that way it serves as another sticking point for his contract next time around.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see who pushed towards the hearing more, right? Because coming out of this arbitration, you knew it was going to be a 1-year deal. Based on where Samsonov's unrestricted free agency falls, there was no other award that you could give. So the arbitrator was going to give a 1-year deal. I'm more kind of curious to see who pushed for that. Was it Samsonov, who wanted the ability to become an unrestricted free agent earlier and go, okay, I'm going to bet on myself and I'm really going to try to have a whale of a season, and then I get my choice. I can do what I want. I can maybe hold this against the Maple Leafs later, or I can test the market. Or was it Toronto, who wanted the flexibility of being able to say, look, the only player that we signed for more than 1 year was Ryan Reeves. So we're not signing players to longer than 1-year contracts. We are not going to do this with Samsonov. We want flexibility. We want the option to move in a different direction if it doesn't turn out that he's our guy. Who pushed for this? That's what I'm really kind of wondering about, because you knew going into the hearing it was a 1-year deal. That was just how it had to work. So I'm kind of curious to see, like, who was the motivating factor behind wanting to go there? Was it the player who wanted the flexibility, or was it the team who wanted the ability to move on if they chose to do so? So that's what I find very interesting. But yeah, if he wanted the 2 or 3 year deal, he would have had to avoid the hearing. So that didn't happen. Somebody said, nope, not a long-term deal. So it's interesting.
And also, I think the second buyout window was more important, I think, in regards to the Maple Leafs as well. I think they wanted to try and go that route, because even leading up to the arbitration case, I heard that they said that apparently they weren't far off. But then again, I think they wanted to get that second buyout window for, you know, possibly a Matt Murray buyout or what have you, for what can happen in the future. But now that they have that, now that the case is settled, now that Samsonov said that he doesn't have hard feelings with everything that happened, he's focusing on the season at hand. I think that's a good sign that maybe the relationship isn't quite as fractured or broken as many were trying to make it out to be as they went to the arbitration case as well.
Well, the Murray situation is really interesting for me because, one, you could have settled this arbitration prior to the hearing and gotten Samsonov on a 1, 2, 3 year deal and then still bought out Matt Murray. But I don't know if Matt Murray's even a candidate for a buyout. Last thing we'd heard was Elliot Friedman making comments that injury situation and other things that they might not be able to buy him out. So if that's the case, that's going to be very, very intriguing, because I'm assuming what most people are assuming is that they wanted this arbitration filing so that they had the option to buy out Matt Murray. That it went to the hearing was more about the 1 year deal than anything else. But if you can't buy out Matt Murray, and if that is the reality of the situation and you have to do something else, whether it's trade him or I don't know, that's going to be weird to me, because Muzzin's going on LTIR, and maybe Matt Murray can do that too, but I don't know, right? So yes, filing for arbitration gave them the option, but we're going to find out here in the next 72 hours whether or not they're going to do this.
Absolutely. We thought that there were a lot of questions answered, but I think there are more unanswered questions at this point, because a lot of hypotheticals that can happen with players currently on the roster right now. And as I briefly touched upon it before, I think that this is a good opportunity for Samsonov to bet on himself once again, because he signed that 1 year, $1.8 million contract after he was intended an offer from the Washington Capitals. had the season that he did, 27, 10 and 5, and I believe he was 19, 3 and 3 at home. Fantastic home record. What does he need to do right now to try and replicate that success? Is it just, keep the momentum going and make sure that, he's still being touted as a number one goaltender that he's working hard to be?
He just needs to do what he did last year. He just needs to do it more, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like he played 42 games last year with a 2.33, goals against and a 919 save percentage. Those are fine numbers. Those are absolutely fine. If that's what you're going to get out of him throughout the year, then you're in great shape. The question mark surrounding him is whether or not he can do that for more than 42 games. And if he cannot do that, then you're the Maple Leafs looking at this going, okay, well, maybe he's not our guy. He's never had to do it, right? It's never been a situation where he's played as many games as they're going to ask him to play this year, especially if there is no Matt Murray and you've got Joseph Woll as your backup. You're not giving Joseph Woll 40 games, right? You need to make sure that Samsonov can do this over an extended stretch. So he doesn't really have to do anything different. He just needs to prove that he can do it more, right? Like if he can do it for 55 games or 60 games, which is pretty rare now in the NHL to play a goalie that often. But if he can do it, there's no doubt that Toronto's probably going to look at extending him, or he's going to have a lot of suitors in free agency, calling on him going, okay, well, he did it the year before for 42 games and he did it again this year with 55 games under his belt. He's a guy that we're looking at. So if he can continue to do it just for more games, he's in great shape.
And I think the big thing is with Toronto goaltenders is they've when they're in that contract year, they don't find that consistency that they need to when they sign like a longer term extension, like they would like a 4 or 5 or 6 year deal. Obviously Anderson had a good first 3 seasons, but it kind of tailed off and it didn't warrant a contract extension. Jack Campbell looked great in a small sample, but then tailed off before he hit free agency and signed his contract. And now you see the numbers of what happened afterwards. So I think maybe the Maple Leafs are also being a little bit cautious that they say, hey, this 1 year could lead to something more if you decide to stay with us. If not, then you could hit the open market if it's well without or out of their range in terms of what they want, considering similar to what they're dealing with William Nylander, and we will get to him in just in a quick moment. But I think the be patient approach, or not the be patient approach, but the cautious approach is sitting in with the Maple Leafs because they don't want to commit long term. Because you've seen even another instance with Sergei Bobrovsky where he signed that $10 million contract, I believe 7 years, didn't look great for 4 or 5, and now all of a sudden he's back to possibly his best that we have seen beforehand. He signed that contract and, putting up like numbers in the postseason, vaulted the Panthers to the Stanley Cup Finals. So I think maybe that cautious approach is also setting in with the Maple Leafs, that maybe that 1 year is another stepping stone to say, hey, you continue to do this and you want to stay here, there will be a spot for you next time around.
Well, and if you look at his year prior to joining the Maple Leafs, where he's in Washington, he played 44 games. So he actually played 2 more games than he did against Toronto, but his save percentage was 896. So I don't know if that means, hey, if you start to get into a certain game range, the numbers go down a little bit. I couldn't tell you in that season if it was like the last few games that he played where he just wasn't as good, or if that was just overall throughout the season, he wasn't quite as good as he was last year in Toronto. But there's reason for the Maple Leafs to go, we don't know who this is yet. Right. Like you can look at him in Washington and go, well, 896 isn't going to do us any good. 919 does us good. But once he starts to creep into more than 42 games, the numbers don't look as favorable for him. We need to know what he is. And so if you go off the Washington numbers, okay, is he your guy? Probably not. If you're going off the Toronto numbers, it looks pretty good, but you need to prove it. You need to know, and you need to have him on there for 1 more year, even if that means he hits it out of the park and he becomes quite expensive for you. There's a lot of flexibility for the Maple Leafs next summer, especially if the cap goes up here. And they needed the numbers to be low this year. They needed to test him out, make sure they knew what they had, and then they'll take another look at it. So I don't know if he stays after this season, like depending on what happens. For all I know, he could be going out the door, but at least Toronto will have a choice and they'll be able to talk to him again.
And I think that's a big thing too with the cap going up next year. I think maybe Samsonov realizes that, and maybe he's willing to take that 1 more year to try and figure things out to see where he is. And you mentioned his numbers with the Capitals last season, and everyone is saying, "Oh, is he going to be Toronto Samsonov or is he going to be Washington Samsonov?" But in that postseason before he became a Maple Leaf, he had a .912 save percentage in the playoffs, and I believe they were knocked out by the same Florida Panthers. So I think maybe Samsonov may want to get some revenge a third time around. Maybe third time's a charm if they do meet Florida in the postseason, 2 with the Maple Leafs, 1 with the Capitals. So I think maybe revenge might be on his mind a little bit there as well.
Yeah, he played okay in those playoffs. I mean, a 912 is not a bad number. He didn't get a ton of games. He only played the 5 games, but his save percentage was under 3. It was 2.97. So, decent numbers. He's got all the signs that he can be your guy. It's just he has not played enough to commit to him on a decent amount of money for a decent amount of your term, and know that you have all of these other things that you need to do, whether it's Austin Matthews or Mitch Marner coming up in a couple of years, or William Nylander, whatever it is you're doing. And as the new GM, you don't want to make a mistake right out the hop, right? Like if you sign him for 3 or 4 years and he's not your guy, then all of a sudden you're like, oh man, that's not a good first move by me. So they're taking the cautious approach here.
Absolutely. And I think the big thing in his bounce back was he wasn't as, over aggressive in the crease. And I think the new goaltending coach, a new situation and new faces around him helped him get into that mindset and get a little bit more poise and confidence in the crease, and definitely had a big impact on his season because it resulted in, it may not be like a big pay raise, but for him, that's a big one considering how maybe his stock wasn't as high. And this is a good stepping stone for him to getting even further in his NHL career.
Yeah, 3.55 is a good number. It's not so high that he's got this immense pressure on him to be fantastic, but it's not so low that you're like, man, this sucks. Like it's a good number for him. It's right in the market that you can afford to, even if you need to later on down the season, if he doesn't turn out to be your guy. And we don't know exactly what we're getting with Joseph Woll yet. You can go shopping if you need to. So there's some options here.
Absolutely. And we are going to get to Joseph Woll in the second half of our show. But before we do, here's a quick word from the Hockey Writers.
Interested in writing for the Hockey Writers? If you have experience writing about hockey, are passionate about the sport, and are looking to take your writing to the next level, the Hockey Writers could be the place for you. Here at THW, you will have the opportunity to hone your craft at one of the world's largest and most respected hockey publishers. You will have control over what you write, be able to seek out media credentials, and be supported by a large network of writers and editors. Plus, you'll get paid for doing it. If you're interested and want to know more about team openings and requirements, please visit the Write for THW page on the Hockey Writers website. A link to that page is also listed in the description.
And we are back with the second half of Maple Leafs Lounge. Previously, we were talking about Joseph Woll and what it could mean for him, but we want to save that for the last bit of our show. We want to get to what this means for like the star players, specifically William Nylander. And Jim, as a result of the arbitration case, you wrote a piece, Nylander on notice, Maple Leafs and Samsonov go to arbitrator. And you had a good section on there will William Nylander take notice on this as a result of Treliving being okay with, setting the tone in terms of contract negotiations with the team. And I want to get your take or give your sense of what this may mean for Nylander down the stretch, and if this is going to still be a very dicey contract negotiation.
Sure. I guess the first thing I should probably say to start this whole thing off is we don't really know what Nylander's thinking, right? Mm-hmm. So he might not take notice of this at all. Like he might look at this and go, this doesn't pertain to me. I'm William Nylander. I'm going to ask for what I'm going to ask for. I don't care what anybody else is doing. That is absolutely how he could react to all of this. So having said that, I also want to point out that the arbitration here is not necessarily the factor that I'm comparing, right? It's because Nylander's not in for arbitration. He didn't have that leverage to use. It's none of that. What I was more referring to in the article was really that Treliving said he could have gotten the Samsonov deal done. He could have done it before the hearing. He could have signed him for a couple of years. He could have probably given him a little bit more money. He chose not to. And so he decided that he was going to give him the lowest possible salary cap he could. And it pushes him right into unrestricted free agency at the end of next year, which is a real risk because if Samsonov plays really well, he could just leave. He could absolutely walk away. Now, Toronto could try to trade his rights at the draft or something, but at the same time, he's going to have the option to stay or go or do whatever he wants to do. Now, Nylander's kind of holding Toronto to what we hear is about a $10 million ask. And if Treliving wants to play hardball, he's using the Samsonov arbitration filing and case and letting him go to an arbitrator to say, look, I'm not going to be pushed around here. Like, this is not a situation where I'm going to say, okay, yeah, this is the player that is very valuable to us. And you can make the argument that he's the most valuable goalie that the Toronto Maple Leafs have, that he was still willing to let this guy walk away. He's paying him what he's going to pay him for the year. But after that, there's no guarantees. And that's kind of the situation Nylander's in, right? Like, you could look at Nylander and go, hey, this is a player that we really want. There's major value to have him on our roster this season, but there's also huge value in trading him if he's not going to stick with us. And what do? Do I trade him? And do I get the best return that I possibly can, knowing I'm not probably going to pay him $10 million or more that he wants? Or do I just take the best I can take? I run him as hard as I can for the year. We try to win. We get the most out of him that we can, and we push that problem down the road and we deal with it next summer. And I think he's saying with the Samsonov arbitration hearing, I'm willing to do that. I don't care how valuable you think you are. I don't care exactly where you stand on this roster. If I'm not comfortable giving you what I don't want to give you, I'm not giving it to you. And so Nylander's probably got to look at that and go, if I want to stay in Toronto and I don't want to leave this team in this environment, in this situation, I might have to come down a little bit from my $10 million ask. Otherwise, Toronto's willing to let me walk away. Is that what I want? Maybe it is. Maybe it is what he wants. I don't know. But if he doesn't, he might have to reevaluate where he's standing on this and go, they're willing to let people leave. What does that mean for me?
Absolutely. No, and that's a fair take because, we've seen in the past how Treliving goes into these negotiations. And obviously the ones that he faced with Calgary, we talked about this many times. That was a bit of a different situation, how Tkachuk really wanted out. He didn't want to be in Calgary. Gaudreau was already leaving, so he really couldn't do anything in that regard. But even in the past, he's been hard with the contract negotiations to get the players that he had before, all the roster turnover and changes happen. And he isn't afraid to do what's right for the team. And I think that's what's huge. And I think that may be a bit of the difference in regards to, the contract negotiations that we saw with Dubas, where maybe he was a little bit lackadaisical and maybe he wasn't as aggressive, or saying that, you got to prioritize the team first and then make money the second factor. Because right now I do agree that, Nylander doesn't deserve a pay raise, but he's got to realize what's a little bit more important now. If everyone is starting to take a pay reduction, maybe Nylander should. Again, we talked about how maybe he really shouldn't because he already did it on his last contract. But I do think that Treliving is setting the tone right now for every single player. It doesn't matter if you're a depth player, star player, what have you. You got to earn it. Not necessarily earn it, but you got to choose what's more important at this point. And I think that was a really good take, and how I really like how you made the comparing and contrasting of the two situations. Although a little bit different, it has the same undertone and same premise to it.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm not even sure that some of these players are going to take a reduction. Like, this is not Samsonov taking a reduction. He got what he got from the arbitrator, right? Mm-hmm. Matthews is going to be the highest paid player in the NHL. Like, we know that's what's probably going to happen here, right? He's going to have a ton of leverage. If he chooses to take less, he'll take less. If he doesn't, he won't. And Toronto's probably going to pay him anyway, right? It's guys like Nylander who are valuable, but you don't necessarily know if they're $10 million valuable, and you can probably move on without him. And if that's the situation, and Treliving believes that he is not going to be held ransom by a player who wants what he's not comfortable giving him yet, he's going to just run with next year's team. And he's going to say, you know what? This is the best roster I can put together for the next 82 games, and whatever else we can get out of the playoffs. We need Nylander on this team to do that. So we're going to do that. And if it means he's leaving, he's leaving. And we're going to take this and we're going to run with it as much as we can. And Treliving's just comfortable with that, I think. Like, I don't think it's what he wants, but he's comfortable that that is the consequence of where this could go. And if that's the case, then Nylander, it's in his court to go, okay, well, I don't want to leave. Right. So, okay, what do I do? So he might not take a reduction. He might just walk, and Treliving might know it. And it just sounds like this whole Samsonov situation, because we don't know what happens when you come out of a hearing. You don't know how the player feels after going through that process. You don't know if bridges are burnt. You don't know if guys are bitter. That could be the start of a divorce between these two people, or it could be fine. We don't know. But if that's the case, Treliving was comfortable with that too. Right. And so he's either betting on the fact that they'll make up and everything will be fine, or he knows this is the last year we're getting out of Samsonov. This is maybe the last year we're getting out of Nylander. We're going to push these two as hard as we can, and we're going to win as much as we possibly can, and we'll see where it goes.
Fair enough. And that's the big thing with the management team with the Maple Leafs. They keep everything so close to their chest. So we don't know what's going on behind, the scenes in regards to emotions or how everyone is feeling. And kudos on them, because if they got out, then, Maple Leafs or Leafs Nation would be very much up in a storm if that would be the case. Moving on to our final topic, as we discussed about Joseph Woll earlier in the show, this whole contract situation or the 1-year deal with Samsonov could possibly be a good point for Woll, like Samsonov, to prove his worth at the NHL level. Last season, Woll came in, had dealt with a couple of tough situations. When both Samsonov and Murray were injured, he came in, looked really well in 7 games, 6 wins, 1 loss, .932 save percentage, and 2.16 goals against average. And an even tougher situation when Samsonov went down in the playoffs. He came in, looked relatively good, calm and composed in the crease, albeit he was 1-2 in the remaining games. And obviously we saw the look of, of disappointment after that game-winning goal went in Game 5. But Jim, given how Woll has a wealth of experience, albeit in a short sample size in key moments down the stretch of the season and into the playoffs, what are his chances of proving his worth at the NHL level?
Well, the chances of him trying to do it are great, because he's going to play. Like, there's no doubt about it. Matt Murray is not going to be here next year. And if he is, it's going to be for a very, very select few number of games. It'll be Samsonov and it'll be Woll, unless Toronto does something else here that's just right out of left field and figures out how to get another goaltender or something like that, which I don't see happening. But I think Woll's he's playing 25 games, like maybe 30, right? So I could see this being a situation where, he's got 7 games from last year in the regular season and 4 games of the season before. Certainly not a big enough sample size to make any sort of a judgment on what he's going to be in the NHL, but his numbers in those games are decent, right? And in the playoffs, he played 4 games, the numbers were decent there too. So there should be, if you're using small sample sizes to judge what he could do, he's going to be a decent backup for the next year, and they're betting on it. So he's going to get every chance, every opportunity to prove that he can do this for more than 7 games. So we'll see. It'll be if it turns out that he can. And in Edmonton, where I cover the team a lot, that was the situation with Stuart Skinner, right? He had not played very much, but everybody was like, man, this guy needs a chance because he's going to be very good. And they just didn't play him. And so now they are playing him. It proved that he is quite capable. He was an all-star. He was a Calder Trophy candidate, and he's their starter now pretty much, unless Jack Campbell comes back and has a fantastic rebound season. He's what they hoped that, they were getting when they brought Skinner through the prospect system and brought him up. So yeah, I think that's what they're hoping for Joseph Woll, that, these small sample sizes are the real deal, and that he's going to get an opportunity this year, and they need it because it's important that he play well.
Yeah, it's great that you brought up the Stuart Skinner story, because it seems like that's kind of the same projection or path that Woll may be on, in terms of, having a bounce back, playing the AHL, looking like he was ready to move on and graduate from that level. Comes into the NHL, getting his looks, looking really good. Now it's just finding the consistency in playing him a little bit more. And I think that will be the case this season, because he has looked great. He has shown improvement. Even the season before then, yeah, he looked shaky at times, but he looked more composed in regards to his rebound control, his ability to track the puck. He was fantastic in the games that he's played in. And there were some tough outings too. And he was the backstop that the Maple Leafs needed when, again, the team wasn't that great in front of them, both the regular season and the playoffs. I do want to ask you this as well, that 1-year contract for Samsonov, is this we said that this is like Samsonov once again betting on him. Is this Woll betting on himself that this is his opportunity to run away with it and potentially be the Maple Leaf starter if they choose to move on from Samsonov?
I don't know that I would say necessarily that he's betting on himself. I think he's just going to get a ton of opportunity from an organization that is betting on him, right? Like, I think that they believe he had a couple rough years with the Marlies in 2019-20 and 2020-21. It wasn't the best. Like, it was okay, but it wasn't great. But for some of these goalies, when they're young, it takes a minute, and then they just sort of figure it out. Some clicks and they get better and they progress in the right direction. And that seems to be what's happening here with him. And I think Toronto's kind of going, I think he's kind of figured this out a little bit. And we believe he's much better than those first 2 years with the Marlies, and this is going to be a player that we can probably count on. So I think the organization is saying, we see something in this player that we believe he's ready. And if that's the case, then they are counting on him to be what they think he is, in a prospect who maybe has figured this out. And if that's what they're getting for the next year, this is really just Woll being confident in himself to go, I am what they think I am. I believe I'm ready. I believe I figured this out. I believe my NHL numbers are better, and they are, than his Marlies numbers early on. And that this is more my trend. This is where I'm going, and not what we saw my first couple years in the AHL. So I think all signs point to this being the right decision. And we're going to find out as soon as he plays these number of games. We're going to know for sure.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you brought up his early season with the Marlies. Yeah, exactly. The numbers weren't great. It was a rough transition from him from collegiate level to the pro level. And he's also dealt with a lot of injuries himself. And now hopefully that is behind him, because after that, it seemed like he was taking that progression every single season in regards to his numbers. After 880 in 2019-20, he was at 892 2021, 911 the season after that. With that was his number with the Maple Leafs, but 907 with the Marlies and 927 last season in 22-23 with the Marlies. So yeah, that progression has been there. And it's also interesting to note that, or not interesting, but it's worth noting that he is not waiver exempt. So if you send him down, there's the chance that some team is going to pick him up, and then you are out of another goaltender in the system that's having that promise. And if you're the Maple Leafs right now, where you have promising goaltending prospects in the system, none are near where Joseph Woll is at right now, and you can't afford to lose him. So it's best to probably keep him on the roster and give him the playing time and minutes that he deserves every so often.
Yeah, that's a good point, because the Toronto's not running with a three-headed monster in goal. Like, they're just not. So Samsonov and Woll are your two guys, and you're right. You're not going to risk losing him by putting him on waivers, because somebody will probably pick him up gambling that he is going to be a future starter at some point in the NHL. So yeah, that's the guy. Like, that's who they're running with here, and they'll figure out the Matt Murray situation one way or the other, whether it's a buyout or trade or something. LTIR, they're probably crossing their fingers. You never want a guy to be hurt, but that's the best option for Toronto. But yeah, Woll's a guy, and he's going to get a good look.
I think that's a safe bet heading into next season, that Samsonov and Woll are going to be the tandem, and whatever happens with Murray, unfortunately, we all wish that he could bounce back. It just wasn't there this season. So whatever ends up happening, that's going to be the end result in regards to that. But yeah, this whole Ilya Samsonov contract has opened up a world of possibilities for the Maple Leafs right now. This is definitely going to be a very, very interesting season ahead, with Samsonov and Woll as the backup, and what can lead to after that. That's definitely going to be something that many are going to be keeping an eye on come the 2023 off season.
I have a feeling we're going to have a lot to talk about next week too, because we are looking at a situation where Toronto's $12 million over the salary cap right now, and they're going to be putting in Muzzin on LTIR, but we don't know exactly what's happening with Matt Murray. But by then we will have an indication as to what's going on with Murray, whether they're doing a buyout or not. And if they're talking about trades or they're doing, I think it could be an interesting week for Toronto, because they have time before they have to get under the cap, but they're over the 10% now. Yeah. Right. So they're going to have to do something, right? You can't go, you can only be over by so much, and they're over by a lot. So there's something coming here. Something's dropping.
A lot is definitely basically an understatement for them, because they're way over the salary cap at this point. But then again, camps open up, I believe, mid-September. So there's quite a bit of time for them to get underneath the salary cap and get into within that range. So like you said, it is going to be a busy week in the next few weeks, because there's going to be a lot of movement in regards to what can happen in regards to the Maple Leafs roster. It seems like right now we were in the dog days of summer, but now it looks like it's starting to pick up a bit in regards to content, and talking points. So we'll see what happens next week. That is all that we have for this episode of Maple Leafs Lounge. Thank you again for tuning in. Be sure to check out the Hockey Writers, as the offseason coverage is continuing on right now with all of our fantastic writers spreading across all 32 NHL teams. There's a lot of prospect talk, a lot of potential breakouts, 2023-24 season previews happening right now during the off season. So be sure to check out that from the terrific writing staff over at the Hockey Writers, including Jim and myself. That is all that we have for the Maple Leafs Lounge. For Jim Parsons, I am Peter Baracchini, and we will see you next time on the Maple Leafs Lounge.